Thank you, Mr. President. I want to commend the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee for his hopes for more bipartisanship and his concern about the way the Senate is working today. I appreciate that. I think we all hope that in the new year there will be more bipartisanship. I think there's some areas where we could work together. On this issue, though, I think we have some just basic disagreements, and we're still debating those and articulating our differences before we cast a vote tonight. I've said for a number of weeks now, if not months, but certainly weeks, when describing the bill that's before us, the prior iteration of the bill in the Finance Committee and the version in the House, I just thought that each one of them had a few things in common in my judgment. This is my sense of the overall bill. First of all, I think every one of these bills has been a giveaway to the rich or the super rich and a giveaway to profitable corporations. I think it's excessive. We have a difference of opinion on that. This is a tax bill, and yet it'll have a substantially adverse impact on health care because of one basic provision that was added in the last couple of weeks. That provision alone will cause health care premiums to increase by an additional 10% a year and will cause 13 million people to lose their health care, according to the Congressional Budget Office, including, by one estimate, 5 million fewer Americans benefiting from Medicaid. At a time when we should invest substantially in the middle class, invest in our children, our roads and bridges, our schools, scientific research, skills training, broadband in rural communities, you could make the list even longer. This tax bill prevents that from happening in a significant way because of the giveaways that I talked about to profitable corporations and the super rich. This bill will literally pay for a permanent corporate tax cut on the backs of middle-class families in the next decade. Congress's official scorekeeper, the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, tells us that in the next decade, meaning the second 10 years that this bill is in effect, the bill uses hundreds of billions in tax increases on working families to pay for a permanent corporate rate cut. I'll say that again. In the next decade, taxes go up for you across America, working families, to pay for a 14 percentage point cut for profitable corporations. This kind of result, where you have a corporate tax break which increases debt and someone else has to pay for it down the road, this is a result that only a swamp dweller could support. But unfortunately, that's where we are today. How about for children? A lot of discussion about the child tax credit. Thankfully, there was debate about that. We don't talk about children in this body nearly enough, or that tax credit. But unfortunately, even the proposals by some on the Republican side weren't adequate enough. Even the ones rejected may not have been enough. Under this legislation, parents of 10 million children in the lowest income working families will either receive no improvement in the child tax credit or a token increase of $1 to $75. The last-minute changes to the bill, which got a lot of publicity in the last couple of days, those last-minute changes to the bill will do nothing additional for these families. Another 14 million children in low and middle-income working families would get something by way of the child tax credit, but less than the full $1,000 per child increase that a family making $400,000 a year would receive. For a fraction of the hundreds of billions of dollars going to the very wealthy and profitable corporations, we could have we could have in this bill made sure that every low-income parent gets the full $2,000 per child tax credit. But because the way the bill's written doesn't allow that to happen for every low-income parent. I think that would have been a worthy goal of the legislation, but that's not where we are. To say that's unfair is a vast overstatement. The families who need it the most aren't getting the full benefit of the child tax credit. I should say the child tax credit increase. But those who are wealthy get an extra $2,000 a child in tax credit. I mentioned the Joint Committee on Taxation before. Let me give you another way to look at the bill, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. The JCT estimates that in 2019 alone, the second year the bill is in effect, were it to pass, 2019 alone, more than $36 billion in tax cuts will go to households worth more than $1 million. That's in the document entitled JCX-68-17, Joint Committee on Taxation. $36 billion cut to the wealthiest Americans, while over 57 million middle-class households, my definition for those making under $100,000, will see a tax increase or a tax cut of less than $9 a month in 2019. So for 57 million middle-class households, they will see a tax increase or a tax cut of less than $9 a month in 2019. Instead of lining the pockets of the rich with an additional $36 billion in tax cuts in 2019, those dollars, that money could have been used to connect Americans to the internet, especially Americans who live in rural areas. 40%, or let me be more precise, 39% of rural America, the people living in rural America, don't have high-speed internet in the United States of America.
Would my colleague yield?
Yes.
My colleague is making a very important point, and I think it'd be great if you would repeat those figures, because all night we have had Republican senators come to this floor and say, hey, middle class, just wait till February. Wait till February, your paychecks are going to be bulging. And I think what my friend from Pennsylvania has just said is using this new data that we just got from the Joint Committee on Taxation, what we have picked up, and my friend from Pennsylvania has clearly done his homework, is that something like 67 million taxpayers, 60 million taxpayers with an annual income of $200,000 or less are going to get practically nothing, maybe $100 a year in tax relief or a tax increase. So I think what my colleague is talking about, and I'd like him to just walk me through those numbers he used, because I think it directly contradicts what we have been hearing last night, where one Republican senator after another is saying it's just going to be good times come February because your paycheck is going to bulge. Could my colleague just repeat what he found?
I want to make sure people know the document. This is the document entitled JCX-68-17. And if you look at that category of Americans who are making $100,000 or less, that's 57 million households who make $100,000, or I should say under $100,000, under $100,000. They would see either a tax increase of one kind or another, or a tax cut of less than $9 a month in 2019. I don't think that's much help when you consider that it's not as if that's the only revenue available. That's all that we can come up with is $9 a month, because I just walked through the other number, which is relevant, the $36 billion that will come in 2019 that the bill is in effect going to households worth more than $1 million. If I had to choose, I would say we should give all of that $36 billion to middle-income families or folks trying to get to the middle class, or at least a substantial percentage of $36 billion. I've been asking for months, why do people making more than $1 million, why does that category of Americans need $36 billion in tax cuts? I don't think they do. It's interesting, I want to commend the work of the ranking member of the Finance Committee in some of our debates. One of the numbers that came out in the last couple of weeks is what's happened to the top 1% since 1980. I said several times they've had a bonanza. I didn't have an exact number when I said that, now I do. Since 1980, their share of national income, these are folks in the top 1%, which is less than $1 million a year, but it's about $730,000 and up. So that's the 1% goes beyond the millionaires and up. But the top 1% since 1980 has had their share of national income go from 11% to 20% from 1980 to 2014, so almost double. So my point is, they've done pretty well since 1980. Why do a big share of them, meaning the $1 million and up crowd, why should they get $36 billion in this tax bill? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's one way to look at it, what we could invest these dollars in. A bigger tax cut for the middle, a bigger tax cut for those struggling to get to the middle, working families trying to get to the middle, or other priorities like infrastructure. I mentioned just one idea on rural broadband. I think rural America should get some help being connected to the internet. That's one way that we could focus on priorities. Let me give you another example, the estate tax. As many people know, in this bill, the estate tax, or I should say once fully implemented, the bill doubles the estate tax that is exempting the first $22 million of inheritance from the tax, which is $11 million per individual. The cost of doing that will be roughly $9 billion a year. Now, the earlier versions of the House and Senate bills, that number was a lot higher. It was a lot higher revenue loss from the elimination of the estate tax. But there's still, even with the changes, a revenue loss of an estimated $9 billion a year. Well, what could we do with $9 billion? Well, we know that in the midst of this debate about the Children's Health Insurance Program, that we need to fund for 5 years of the Children's Health Insurance Program. That's roughly the number that we need. So 1 year of revenue loss from the estate tax equals 5 years, roughly, of paying for the Children's Health Insurance Program, and that's not done yet. That Children's Health Insurance Program expired September 30th. I hope that in the midst of all of this work on tax policy, that we're going to get that done. And I know the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee for years, from the beginning, has been a strong advocate of the Children's Health Insurance Program, and I commend him for that. But we've got to get it done in a few short days, getting it reauthorized. I wanted to talk as well about, and I know I probably am limited on time, I'll move quickly, the Republican budget, because you can't really read the tax changes in isolation. You have to also consider them in the context of the Republican budget resolution that passed. That budget proposal, which did pass, proposes to cut Medicaid by $1 trillion over the next 10 years. So that's $1 trillion with a T for Medicaid. The Republican budget also proposes to cut Medicare by over $400 billion over the same period, over 10 years. So the proposal roughly proposes to cut about $1.5 trillion from just Medicare and Medicaid. All the while, this Republican tax bill contains almost the same amount of unpaid for tax cuts. Now, we heard recently from Speaker Ryan that he wants to, quote, reform, unquote, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Well, my view of that is when they talk about reform in that context, that means cutting funding for programs that working men and women of my home state of Pennsylvania and the country have paid into to ensure they have some retirement savings and a safety net for when tragedies and unforeseen events occur. Some people refer to Social Security and Medicare as, quote, earned benefits, because they are. They've earned those benefits for Social Security and Medicare. How about outsourcing? The Republican tax bill gives U.S. companies who offshore jobs a large tax cut on old profits unavailable to companies who kept jobs and production in the United States. This means that a company who outsourced to Mexico to take advantage of cheap labor will pay less taxes on accumulated profits than a domestic company who kept jobs in the United States. In fact, once the bill is enacted, some profits from an overseas factory may never be taxed in the United States, while a company that keeps those jobs here could be taxed at the U.S. corporate tax rate. This disparity could actually encourage companies to move production and jobs overseas. We mentioned earlier the tax cut for major corporations. One of the great leaders of corporate America for many, many years, Jack Bogle of Vanguard, said the following a few weeks ago, and this isn't I don't know what political party Jack Bogle is, but he said this most recently about corporate profits. Quote, corporate profits after taxes last year were the highest they've ever been in the history of GDP, going back to 1929. And he goes on to say, Jack Bogle, and we're thinking of giving relief to the corporations at the highest levels ever. Individual wages are at the lowest level in about 15 years as a percentage of GDP. Not my words, Jack Bogle's words. So corporations will have a tax windfall to spend on increasing executive compensation if they want, or increasing stock buybacks, or increasing dividends. All this with absolutely no guarantees that workers will see benefits from this tax cut, despite assertions by many here in Washington about what would happen on wages and other benefits. Mr. President, I just have maybe 3 more minutes, and I know we're maybe a little over time. There's been a little bit of discussion, not enough, about what happens to the Consumer Price Index, which is used to measure, or is used as a baseline for measuring programs over time. Maybe the most pernicious tax, and that's the best word for it, in the bill is the so-called chain CPI, which alters the way inflation is measured. This bill raises an estimated $134 billion on the backs of hardworking Americans by changing how the tax code measures inflation, so-called chain CPI. So it's a measurement of inflation that's going to change, and that's going to have an adverse consequence for untold millions of Americans. This number grows over time. The Joint Committee on Taxation told us that this single provision increases taxes by at least 3 times as much in the next decade as it did in the first decade, potentially as high as $400 billion in the second 10 years. This will be in full force when a lot of young people are entering the workforce. Someone who's just starting their professional life will see this tax increase haunt their paychecks for the next 50 years. So there's a lot we could talk about in terms of missed opportunities here, but let me just conclude with this, Mr. President. There's nothing in this bill that invests in rebuilding America. I thought we'd have an opportunity to do that, as we seem to be headed a couple of years ago, but we don't have that opportunity with this bill. We could be using this opportunity to make a substantial investment in roads, bridges, schools, water systems, or the like. That won't happen. In our state, we've got 4,500 structurally deficient bridges. We wish that we would have some more help in addition to state dollars going for those. Nothing in the bill to expand college affordability, nothing to ensure workers' wages increase. Amendments like that were offered in the committee, and it was all Democrats for the amendment, all Republicans against it. Those in the middle class and those working to join the middle class continue to tread water in this bill while the super rich zoom ahead. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.